First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. First Tea has been working with brewers on a wide range of teas and botanicals in popular and successful beers. First Tea combines flexible order sizes with the experience you need to create innovative and successful craft beers. They get you the most direct to farm tea selection so that you are working with flavorful and consistent products. You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com or by emailing them at info@firsttea.com. That's FIRSDTEA.com.
Hello, I'm Shaun O'Sullivan of the 21st Amendment, and this is a special bonus episode of the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest is Chuck Silva of Silva Brewing, and he is here for a conversation that goes beyond the brew house and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. First, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media at allaboutbeer. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Now, a bit about my guest today. Chuck Silva is an American Brewers Guild graduate who has spent 18 years brewing in San Diego from 1998 to 2015, with the last 11 notably at Green Flash Brewing. Well known for poignant hoppy beers, Belgian-inspired creations, barrel-aged stout, wild ales, and many more before moving on to ignite his very own passion project, Silva Brewing. Positions at other breweries included in his San Diego tenure include Hang 10 Brewing Company, Hops Bistro and Brewery, and Karl Strauss Brewing Company. Chuck is currently operating Silva Brewing, established in 2015 with his wife MJ in a small 3,000 square foot Paso Robles facility with a 10-barrel brew house producing less than 1,000 barrels a year, about 1,800 barrel capacity as of 2022. Beer profiles range from fresh hop infused delights to uniquely wild ales like the 2020 release Vivici, convergent French and Belgian fluent styles like Chuck-a-Muck, new versions of classic styles like Hefeweizen Pilsner and Smoked Porter, plus stouts that are barrel-aged to perfection. Ever inspired, you will discover Chuck's wine country influences as Chuck and wife MJ have been working on a new passion project, Amok Cellars, a winery operating the same space as Silva Brewing since 2020. Chuck, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Shaun.
I mean, it's exciting to have you here. I have to just sort of I always think it's interesting how these things come about. I mean, the Brewer to Brewer podcast is sort of a passing the baton that takes place amongst us, brewing professionals. And what was unique about this is that I was on a trip just like a month or so ago, coming up from Southern California, and I stopped in Paso Robles in at your place just to have a beer with my gal Gwen. And you were just rolling in from a festival, and I was surprised to see you there because it was a weekend, and maybe you're there, maybe you're not. And then you were unloading your truck and you were just kind of singing in the background, "I'm going to have a beer with Shaun O'Sullivan." And I don't know if you remember that, but anyway, that struck me. Yeah. And then you and I got to talking, and I was just, the stories you were telling me, both about your experience with Silva Brewing, your new brewery, but also the stories you were talking about with Green Flash. And so I was like, my gosh, I need to call up good old John Hall and get, you on this podcast because I think just like Mitch Steele, who had great insight into, his Anheuser-Busch experience, well, first of all, your entire career, in the span of that, but very notably, not to detract from the 900 gorilla in the room, but your experience at Green Flash was, very significant, not only for you, but for that company, but also for the arc of craft beer in general, that, has affected all of us today. So that's my long-winded way of patting you on the back.
Much appreciated. I very much remember that the day of the Central Coast Brewers Guild, and it was such a delight. I hadn't seen you for years.
Yeah.
So I was like, I saw you out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, is that Shaun O'Sullivan? And then I got a better look, and it's like, oh yeah, all right. So I'm going to go have a beer with Shaun. I actually, interestingly enough, I did make it to the new facility in San Leandro at one point, and you know, so I got to go to 21st A at the big brewery, and I think I was hanging out with Roger Davis, and
No.
so you can imagine, good times were had. Clearly we didn't, you know, reach out to you or
These
see if
things happen.
or just see if you were available. I think it was just like on a whim, I was able to come up and as I
Yeah.
very much love to visit the Bay and I like to come up for beer week, etc. But we did get to see your facility, so congrats on that, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. It's our huge behemoth in San Leandro.
That happened about the same time that I
Yeah,
resigned from Green Flash and came up here to Paso Robles,
yeah, we started construction in
2015.
2014 there in San Leandro, and then the old Kellogg's plant, and started brewing in 2015. So yeah,
Nice.
you opened your Silva Brewing, and when was that?
And a
2015.
year, yeah, 20, actually we didn't open until 2016, December 2016
Mm-hmm.
we opened, and we actually had one beer on tap,
What
Paso
was
Pale.
that?
Paso Pale.
Paso Pale.
Yeah. It just
That's
seemed
awesome.
appropriate. Yeah.
You know, I always think like, for first of all, this really, I mean, what you just described really showcases like the camaraderie this community has. I mean, everybody kind of knows each other. It's always like, not 6 degrees of separation, but it's like 2 degrees of separation. But one thing I'm always like curious about with our ilk is like, your past is that your family had the construction business. You didn't really want to go into that. You got involved in the Navy. You had one tour of duty, and then you kind of saw the conflict that might have with the family life, and so you jumped ship. You went to like Virginia. You got involved in the in defense industry. That seemed to be fizzling up on you, or they're going to send you somewhere you didn't want to go. So from what I remember, you from our early conversation we had a few weeks ago, is that you ended up moving to San Diego. But before all that, I think I got that right.
Yeah,
You
that's all right.
you How did you get into craft beer? I mean, that's the thing that always gets me. It's like,
Right.
and because the thing about it is that we kind of track in some ways, and a lot of us track this way. We have these other careers, and then we kind of ditch it. I mean, I was in the legal world. I had a bunch of other stuff working at CNN, blah, blah, blah. But, I ditched it all to become an assistant brewer at Triple Rock way back in the day. And you had, a fairly like, you had an arc of a career going on in the defense industry as a consultant, and really you're probably doing fairly well. What drove you into this industry?
Right. Yeah, I gave up a career path that I could have stuck with and I would have done very well, and was paid very well. And but I just saw that, for sort of my happiness and just just to kind of seek out life from a different angle. I just felt like I could do something different, and it would be okay. And even if it didn't work out, I can always just step back to the trades or just do whatever the next thing was. So I took up home brewing, of course. During Isn't that where it all starts? It doesn't all
It's the
start
gateway
there.
drug.
So no, I'll step back. We'll come back to home brewing in a bit. But for me, the interest in beer, right? Where's the interest in beer come from? So my dad actually used to drive for Coors back in the day when there was only a couple places, and two in California, and he was a driver. So it was all cold, cold storage, cold delivered at that point. And so that was interesting. So we got to try some. I was pretty young still at that point. We weren't drinking whole beers, or at least I wasn't. But not too much longer. I'm a teenager and I'm working in the construction trade, which was our family trade. And inevitably, at the end of the day, there was beer on ice. The philosophy was really that if you're working like a man, you can have a beer like a man at the end of the day. And so, as a teenager, I had access to beer, and it was not craft beer. It was
Yeah.
macro brewed beer, whether it was, Budweiser or Lucky Lager or
Mhm.
Coors or whatever it was for that day. Um, and then in that moment, I discovered there were other things. There was Lowenbrau, there was, Henry Weinhardt's Private Reserve, and so those were kind of early discoveries that.
So what was your dad, because he was working for this beer distributor, like bringing over like 6 packs of Lowenbrau or and throwing them
No,
on ice?
no. The Lowenbrau, I was able to acquire that somehow on my own. So yeah, as a teenager. So I don't know where I had access to like the
But you
Heineken and
did, but you had it.
Lowenbrau.
You
So
got a
it was
different
the
taste for
Coors.
different beer. Yeah,
It was the Coors that came home.
yeah.
And it was like, okay, we're having a barbecue, or at home you can have
Hmm.
a beer, half a beer, or sip a beer or something. So that's where I was able to taste that originally. Yeah. And the banquet beer is actually still got I have a fondness still for that.
I think every brewer has a dirty little secret, and mine is I have a 6 pack of Coors Light in the back of my fridge.
Oh, no, no, no. So no, it can't be Coors Light. No, it has to be the banquet beer for me.
Well, all right. That's your world. Okay. So what? You got a taste for it. You're a kid, so you started home brewing. So where did you start home brewing?
So that was after my Navy days, and where I actually, was grounded. I had a home that, I wasn't traveling all the time with on board a ship,
Hmm.
and I was able to buy a kit. But I was introduced to some homebrew. Ended up meeting a fellow, and I mentioned him before. I actually still can't remember his name. It's not somebody that I've stayed in touch with, but it was somebody that I ended up befriending after Navy time, and not work related at all. So I'm not even sure how we got connected, but I think it was through another friend. And anyway, he shared some homebrew, and then we ended up, having some more of his homebrew at his house. And I was very inspired by, that he was able to make some quality beer at home. And so I didn't hesitate. I jumped after it and went to the homebrew shop.
So then you flash forward. You end up in San Diego at some
Yeah.
point, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that was
So
all Virginia at that time.
yeah.
Um,
So you're in San Diego, and sort of to contextualize, the scene down there. This is way before Green Flash. What was happening? Because not to jump forward to West Coast IPA Green Flash, but was there uh I guess a surge of new activity of beer styles that were IPAs, where more hops were being used, more full flavor. I mean, what was happening at the time of those 3 breweries you worked at?
yeah, that really took a while actually. So when I landed in San Diego in '98, there was still very much a Coors Light town.
Hmm.
So, but the tap list that had something beyond that, it was Sierra Nevada, Anchor, Bass, Harp, Guinness, and not much more than that, really. Maybe some
Hmm.
Fullers, some Full Sail have been in the market too. So, down from Oregon. And so, the amber beer started to become a thing, the pale ale with Sierra Nevada.
Yes,
And
because
then,
it's
yeah,
interesting because you think about like the ubiquitousness of IPAs in San Diego. Like even thinking 1998, I would have thought that was happening. That's interesting. Like that you weren't having like
it
big bold
barely.
beers like that.
No, barely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was happening at brew pubs.
Okay.
So, my first job was with Paul Segura at Hang Ten Brewing, and we brewed IPA.
Hmm.
And it wasn't aggressively bitter. It was still nicely balanced, and some dry hop, but not extravagantly so, just nicely put together. And you even think about another area, think about Bridgeport Brewing. and
Yeah.
the IPA that they used to brew. It was, very much more, sort of in line with that sort of balanced IPA
But
of
at the
that.
time, though, it was a big deal. It's like, even thinking about Liberty Ale at Anchor. I mean, for all of us,
Right.
that was like mind blowing at the time. And now you think back, it's, all those beers are fairly pedestrian.
Yeah, 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 and we still would reflect on Liberty Ale at that time,
Yeah.
but it was interesting. So the brew pubs are where the push came, because it was easier, of course, for a brew pub to brew a 10 barrel batch, 7 barrel batch, or whatever, and go up the scale on hop bitterness and dry hop, or dry hopping in serving tank, or different options like that are more accessible to brew pubs, and that's actually where the real push came. And the brew pubs were more prolific at that time. The only um, larger breweries, regional craft breweries, were Stone. They weren't even brewing IPA yet. They were
Yeah,
brewing,
I was going to ask you that.
yeah,
So they had not stepped into that pool yet.
no, they were brewing pale. They had the pale ale, but
Hmm.
it wasn't much longer after that. They finally came around with IPA, which was such a delight. It was like, okay, yeah, here we go. We got
Yeah.
some hoppier beer, and um, so it was still a land of discovery for all the drinkers, the craft beer drinkers, and it was a lot of work to get people to try craft brewed beer,
Yeah.
for tap owners, tavern owners, and restaurants to take on craft beer.
What were
Yeah.
kind of like curious because I know my experience up here at Triple Rock Brewing around that time, or even a couple other breweries. Like, what was? I mean, now we have the hops. There's hundreds of hops. It seems like right now, with all sorts of different unique flavors and aromas. What were you using back then? Let's nerd out here for
Oh,
a second.
sure, sure. Probably, if you're looking at IPA, it was probably, more like Chinook and Cascade.
Yeah.
Uh, maybe
Yeah.
even, yeah, yeah, maybe even, um,
Centennial.
yeah. I mean, oh yeah, my Centennial. Now, we weren't big Centennial users. I would say, but Columbus wasn't even available yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Wow.
still.
So you're brewing at these. So when did you move out to San Diego?
So 98. Yeah, right.
98.
So right after, well, so 98, and leaving the defense trade, and
Hmm.
contract work, and um that's actually when I went to brewing school. Went to the American Brewers Guild in February 98, I think, which is coming out in April, and then I got my first job at Hang 10 Brewing Company.
Now, do you think? I mean, you're considered to be this master with many different styles, but with you play with hops quite well. So when were you getting a taste of that? Did that happen at brewing school? After brewing school, was it like, were you getting like, hey, there's something going on here?
It was definitely over time in the brew pubs
Yeah.
first, but then actually going to the craft brewers conferences and
Hmm.
seeing, you could evaluate some. They're out on the table, right? And I remember actually Simcoe being one of those out. I think it was the Portland one. Um, after so 98, I think, was the conference was in Phoenix
Hmm.
Rising, and then after that, I think it was Portland. Anyway, so was an early adapter personally, like Benny Sawyer. So to Simcoe, I just loved it at first, sniff, if you will,
Yeah.
and I was able to sort of. Do you remember Gerard?
Yeah.
Uh,
Gerard. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So he was, representing at the time, and so I was
Forgot
able
about
to.
that name. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
wow, that's
Gerard. Yes.
one of our good guys
So
in the
so
hop world.
yeah, you're in San Diego and you're at Hang 10, you're at Carl Strauss, you're brewing away, but then you get the call, like to the big leagues in a lot of ways. It's like you get called up for a position at Green Flash.
Right.
So, I mean, I always thought you were always there in a lot of ways. So how did that happen? How did you get, anointed, let's say.
Yeah, so the stretch of a brew pub, I did Hang 10, then I did Hops Bistro and Brewery, and that's where I got to push my own buttons really, and push my
Mhm.
own limits, and try the Simcoe, for instance. And then that closed, and then I went over to Carl Strauss, because they had work, and I was like, I need
Mhm.
to work. And so I was there for a year, and then I saw that Green Flash, they were a fledgling brewery. They had opened, and they were making some red and some brown and some pale ale, and not much else. And but I heard they needed a brewmaster, and I was like, well, what I'm brewing at Carl Strauss, is not so inspiring. It was good. It was quality beer. But if I get the chance to brew my own, I get to write the recipes, and so I went and interviewed at Green Flash, and this was in uh 2004,
So you
2004,
you
2003. No, 2004, because 2003 is when I went to work for Carl Strauss.
so 2004 you're there. They've been
Yeah.
open. It sounds like Green Flash had already been open for a couple years, right?
Yeah, the first 2 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
So
then yeah, go
you
for it.
show up. So how do you you come in with some new ideas? So they were they were producing beer, they were distributing it. What how did you convince ownership to sort of like take on, were they looking
They
for
were
something
looking
new, or
for it.
yeah, they were
Well,
looking for
they
somebody to
needed
like,
help. Yeah.
yeah.
So at first and foremost, they just needed someone to come in and make beer and clean up the beer. And I was
Mhm.
able to do that. I was like, okay, well, I've got nowhere to go but up, because they were down enough that they needed help really just on formulation and just quality practices. And I was like, okay, I can step right into that. And I did. And then by the end of the year, so it was what was it, November? And then by the end of the year, going into January, there was a vision to make IPA. Let's make IPA, and let's call it West Coast IPA. Because at that time, there had already been plenty of brewers making IPA, and it was American IPA, right? But there was this talk of West Coast IPA amongst a lot of California brewers, and I would say
Yeah.
more California than Pacific Northwest brewers, because I feel like the Pacific Northwest brewers were a lot more like East Coast brewers. They're using, ringwood yeast. They're not dry hopping. The the dry hopping was definitely a San Diego thing, and other California brewers as well. So that actually really started to make a difference. More hop aroma, more, hop aroma and flavor. The guys up north were using hop back, and that adds nice flavor, but the aroma doesn't survive quite as well. So it helps reinforce
Yeah,
that. So
yeah,
that's where the West Coast,
that's where it
sort
came
of
from.
kind
Yeah,
of ties
because
in.
back in the day, it was like, there was West Coast IPAs. We did talk about it that way. I remember there was East Coast IPAs, of course, maltier, a little more crystal malt, sort of more like, the story was always like, that it's relative proximity to England, like, and that was the influence, because those IPAs were certainly sweeter and fuller body in the sense, with those types of crystal malt, sweeter malts in there. And the West Coast, they were fairly dry. They were dry hop. They were more bitter. It's almost like we didn't talk to each other, or the East Coast brewers didn't talk
Yeah.
to West Coast either. Now everybody's like, everybody's moved around a lot, so
Right.
there isn't really, the style persists, but it's like everybody's making these
Yeah.
styles on either coast. So yeah, that was an interesting time, honestly, because I think that's really like your perception about like what was even happening in the Pacific Northwest. It seemed like an East Coast version of a West Coast IPA, just because they were like fruitier malt or fruitier yeast, and just a lot more malt character.
Yeah, and that didn't happen overnight where that was such a difference.
No.
But if you look back, and you look back further in microbrewery history, it was all about bringing back beer styles. So it was a beer
Mm-hmm.
style revival, and being traditional was a real thing, especially on the East Coast. And then And then you saw some more, maybe a little more innovation up in the Pacific Northwest, and then accessibility to the hops and
Yeah.
Yakima and Willamette. And then things really started to change, maybe with White Labs too, accessibility down in San Diego, having a yeast bank right in our backyard. And then, of course, influence of Sierra Nevada cannot be
Oh
left
yeah.
out in this story. That pale ale that launched thousands of pale ales, and um, you know also eventually IPA, I would say, as was
Yeah.
where IPA really launched out of, sort of, even like the Sierra Nevada Green Label Pale Ale.
So what was that meeting like at Green Flash? Were you like called in the office? You recall, like, and they said, "Hey, we want to kick this up a notch." Was that like, a business decision, or how was that driven? Was that driven by you or the ownership at the time? I mean, because that's kind of a pivotal moment, especially for the style itself, but also for that company.
It was definitely driven from the CEO. He came to me. It was
Mhm.
just more casual. He came to me. It was just like, out on the floor. He's like, "Hey, I want you to make an IPA, and we're going to call it West Coast IPA." And I said, "Well, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to reset the bar. We're going to have to make it extravagantly hopped. It's going to have to be zesty. It's going to have great dry hop character, good hop aroma and flavor, and the bitterness is going to have to be higher because it's going to need to survive." And we were already a packaging brewery at that time, so he's like, "Yes, yes, that's exactly what I want." And so I got busy, wrote a recipe, brewed it. I had already been brewing IPA at the brew pub at Hops Bistro and Brewery, so I went back to that, referenced it, and then it's like, okay, how do I elevate from there? And we had launched what became West Coast IPA, March 1st, 2005. And it changed the company forever.
Yeah. So, and then you had some pretty good success at GABF soon thereafter.
Right. That year, it wasn't with the IPA, the medal, but we won three
Oh,
medals. We won three medals,
okay.
though.
I keep thinking it won a medal in my head though. So, I mean, well,
Oh,
I guess, but to the point, it really, like, I mean, it really put you on the map. I mean, like people started paying,
yeah,
noticing Green Flash. It was like,
it
this
did.
is,
And I had won an IPA medal at Hops Bistro and Brewery before I did that year at Carl Strauss, and that
mhm.
was in 2003. So that was a nice recipe to, base a new IPA on that would be
Mhm.
a new benchmark going forward.
So what happened? You release West Coast IPA, people sit up and take notice. You win three
Yeah.
medals of the GABF that same year. I mean, you must have just, I mean, all the cameras and lights and interest must have just shone bright on you. I mean, what happened? I mean, that's like especially when craft beer is so young at that time in a lot of ways, that there aren't a lot of breweries. I don't know, there's probably what, 2,500 breweries, 3,000 breweries at the time, I would imagine. I might be making that number
Oh
up.
yeah. Not
But
even.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
what was
Maybe 1,500 at that time. So
1,500?
yeah, even before the GABF medals, by August of that year, 2005, the IPA was our number one selling beer. And
Wow.
we had started shipping it, and it was actually even going to the East Coast. It was going to New York and New Jersey, and um, but then we won the medals, and people are like, well, who's this Green Flash? And so samples started getting sent around, and people got a taste of that hoppy beer, and they're like, well, there's no IPA quite like that
Mhm.
available, or at least not widely available. So the demand shot up, and we just couldn't deliver enough at the time.
What what was your distribution like? Where were you selling beer at that time?
Yeah, so we were making another brand called Reaper Ales at the
Hmm.
time, and that was going out to New Jersey distributor. And they said, "Well, what about this Green Flash brand that you have?" And so we threw some samples on the pallet. They got a taste for it, and then it was not even a question. They're like, "Okay, so send us some of that beer." And then before you know it, then we're in New York, and then it just spread quickly from there. We're in Virginia, we're in Pennsylvania, and so it kind of just up and down the East Coast, and then also, just mainly California.
So so your West Coast IPA is going far and wide, but when we spoke before, you were talking about like the idea behind the brand spread that you had at Green Flash was kind of turning everything up to 11. Like the new
Yeah.
brands that you were creating, it was an opportunity to like elevate like you had done with West Coast IPA. So like what other, I know La Freak was part of probably that. I don't know when exactly that came out, but what was happening after, you had kind of thrown this big IPA in the market? What was happening with your other brands?
Right. So the main brands when I came on were more session brands. So like Extra Pale Ale, a red that I revamped to be an alt beer, and a brown ale, and those were the medal winners. Those were the three medal
Okay.
winners at GABI. So so I did a good job with the formulation and cleaned them up, and we won some awards with them. And then they started to get retired because we couldn't brew them anymore because we had to brew so much IPA. And then we would introduce, Imperial IPA in 2006. And then I used some of that Imperial IPA work to make a Belgian version, which became La Freak. And then we made a red that um, that won medals 3 years in a row, and before we actually even put it in bottles.
Oh,
So we were
wow.
just doing it for draft, and so I think we won World Beer Cup Gold in 2008, or right, yeah, 2008, and it was still sitting in tank. I had like 3 tanks of it. So Hophead Red. Um, Such a wonderful zesty red beer, as opposed to just being just sweet, and like a lot of the ambers and red beers were in the past, which used to be like the number one category
Yeah.
for microbrew beer and craft beer was amber and red ale, and then the pale ale pushed in, and then eventually IPA sort of took over.
I
But
like me a
yeah,
good red
everything.
ale.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like red ale too, but I kind of liked it a little zestier. So I pushed it a
Yeah.
little bit and pushed it over to the hoppy side.
So that
And
became kind of like that became the Green Flash thing. The secret
right.
juice was like take a style and push it to the limit.
Yeah. Yeah, we did. But still with enough balance and drinkability.
Yeah.
But they were certainly bolder beers for sure.
Hey, so I'm curious because, you know, obviously IPA has evolved and has like, it's all over the place. You got hazies, you got black IPAs, session IPAs, double I
Yeah.
triple blah 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 IPAs everywhere. So, but West Coast IPAs are seeing another resurgence, which is actually just a term in some ways for clear IPA. It's not
Yes,
as
thank
sweet
God.
like a hazy IPA. It's a style that so people know what they're getting, which makes sense. But I'm wondering, like, when you have like a West Coast IPA today, produced by, let's say a newer brewery, how does it line up against what you were brewing at Green Flash back in the day?
It's quite different.
In what way?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so I have to say I'm fairly confident that it was influenced by the hazy styles, but the hazy IPAs, I feel like they needed to be lighter in color, and they were, and softer and hot profile. And I think that's what you're getting now in the clear West Coast IPAs. But also there was a huge influence even before that hit that in San Diego for just being devoid of crystal malt, caramel malt,
Mm-hmm.
and specialty malts. So it was already leaning towards this really, a pale malt or Pilsner malt profile with hops. And it's almost like, hoppy lager in a way, but which actually has emerged as a sub style,
Yeah.
which is fantastic. I'm actually really enjoying that. But um, Ballast Point came out with Fathom in that whole run up of all wonderful zesty hoppy beers, for instance. But yeah, it's very, just golden and yellow in color, and not very malty tasting, and just very clean and crisp, and just hop focused, but not too gripping
Yeah,
on the bitterness. So
I
yeah,
would
it's more
agree.
refreshing.
I think it's more hop. It's almost hopped like a hazy IPA,
Yeah,
but without the sweetness, but without also the bracing bitterness,
right.
which is what you have in like I think a true, West Coast IPA. That's why I like cold IPA, honestly. I know like cold IPA people, it's like a head scratcher for a lot of people, but it has the bracing bitterness, it has hop flavor, hop aroma. It's fairly unique, I guess, you know, maybe it is a hoppy lager now.
Yeah, right. So I competed our laughing pecker at the best of craft beer awards in Portland, Oregon, and we won a gold medal. And that actually was the first time we used the lager yeast on it. And
Hmm.
and so that was kind of an aha moment for me, thinking, well, okay, instead of Cal Ale yeast or alt beer yeast, or which we've tried, different versions of it, and then the lager just being so clean and crisp, and we just and then the hops really shine too through
Yeah.
all that. It does kind of leave you exposed, so if you're like over hopping, then it's too grassy, or too, so you don't want to have too much chlorophyll, or too much hop sulfur, if you will. But yeah, I think I'm very much enjoying that sort of a newer renaissance in IPA world, but um, we can still miss some of the other versions that aren't so available anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a disciple of Kevin Davey when he was at Wayfinder, and he was brewing cold IPAs there, with an adjunct lager, essentially brewing with 3470, fermenting a little bit
Right.
warmer. It's just a
It
great,
works.
great flavor. It totally works. You're
It
right. You're right.
works.
You're right. So you're at going back to Green Flash. So you're there. I mean, and then I can't imagine like the rocket ship going on there. So you're
Oh
probably, I
yeah.
imagine like you're being pulled in every single direction. Like I imagine like, distribution started going far and wide, and
Right.
you're just pushing as much beer as you can out.
Absolutely. And we had to do a couple of expansions in the smaller brewery that we had at Vista. It was a
Hmm.
25 barrel brew house, no rakes, no auto grain. I was all manual, all hand
Oh,
mash,
good.
hand grain out, 25 barrel
Wow.
brew house. That was the old Tight House
Oh, wow.
brew system. So it actually came out of the bay, and
Wow.
then went down to San Diego. And so we, progressed from there. We were busting at the seams even after the expansion, 90 barrel fermenters, um, and just um, we needed more capacity. So we built a new brew house, which is an amazing, opportunity. I got to work with Ashton Lewis to engineer a brew house that fit the beers that we were making. So larger vessels, wider
Hmm.
whirlpool, wider, louder tons, and two kettles, so we
Yeah, I
could,
remember that. Was that the
yeah.
Sprinkman system? That
No, it
was
was a
that was a
Mueller custom. Mueller
mule.
custom.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I had him put in two kettles instead of a pre-run tank, or a tank that you can run off, to a runoff tank. We just put in two kettles, and internal calandria, so they boil like a champ, and you have opportunities to clean them. You can alternate. We could brew 8 a day.
So it sounds like you definitely cashed in on on the equity of what was happening with the brand, with ownership there. You said, "Hey, if you want to do this right, this is what we're going to do," and you got your like you built your like dream brewery in some ways.
Right. And then it really was rocket ship to the moon. And I ended up, once I got the team up to speed on the new brew house, and we got new KHS bottling, so replace the old bottling filler. The quality, of course, lower errors, and the quality goes up on the product, and the shelf life is better. And then I started traveling even more and more, representing the brand, and that was pretty neat time. And early 2011, 2012,
Hmm.
brewing in Belgium with Saint Foyen, and doing collaborations. Brewed at Banks's Brewery in Wolverhampton, UK, and we did our session, our citrus session IPA for them, basically on their system. Pretty neat stuff.
So you're out there 20, what is this, 20, what year was that when things were really taking off?
Yeah, so 2012, 2011, that system came online, and
Hmm.
2012 we're already just running. We're just running, and we still had room to add fermenters. So we had a
Hmm.
whole second cellar that we could add. We started with 10 250 barrel fermenters, a 50 barrel brew house, and we still had a whole cellar that we could add in, and room to put 500 barrel finishing tanks in.
I
And
remember I visited because we were looking at brew houses, this is a bit later. I think 2013, 2014, we were out there. I think 13. And like, I remember like you had this really unique dry hopping system where you had elevators that would take
yeah,
the hops up to the
it was a
top of
lot
the
of hops.
tanks. And it was
Yeah,
but
a
this
lot of hops.
elevator system was really like interesting. I was like, wow, they got an elevator
Uh,
here.
Now, nobody was riding on that elevator. To be clear, it was just the hops got a free ride to the top, up to
Yeah.
the catwalk, and then we had the ladder at the other end, the OSHA ladder that everybody had to
I'm
climb
sure
up.
you're safe if you said people wrote it right now. I don't think anybody cares.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
you know
Um,
what? I don't want to know if anybody ever did, because nobody was supposed to.
so it sounds like things are cruising along, and at some point, you know, the rocket ship, the trajectory doesn't keep going, and
Oh, yeah.
or some decisions are made that subvert that. And and I can even personally, like with my company, look in the rearview mirror and think about some times where well, maybe we shouldn't have done that, or we should have done something differently. But in the rearview mirror, it always is clear. And then when you're in the moment, you're like, we should be doing this. So like with Green Flash, you were growing, and it was around that time when I think other breweries were looking at expanding capacity to
Yeah.
other locations, in a large part to cut down on shipping to the East Coast. So, breweries on the East Coast. So what was happening, like, you know, you got this new brewery going, you're traveling around the world, and then there's obviously an enormous push for growth, which can be intoxicating. Um, what was when you made the decision to sort of open up the brewery back east? That was in a large part because you needed the capacity at the time, isn't that right?
Well, sort of. And this is actually a sticking point for me. I clearly was not part of that decision to open up
Mhm.
a second brewery on the East Coast. And um, I, in fact, would, you know, advise against that. We still had a lot of capacity left in the facility that we built in Mira Mesa in San Diego. It had 100,000 barrel capacity. So we were, maybe hitting 60, 65,000. And so we still had room to grow, but the curve is flattening out at this point, and it's
Mhm.
flattening out for Stone and Deschutes and Green Flash and other regional craft breweries. It's actually, it's not straight linear rocket ship to the moon at that point. Things are changing in the marketplace. And instead of taking that as a cautionary and holding off on the project, like I believe Deschutes did, I think they pulled out of their Virginia project that they were
Yep.
going to do. Ballast Point built theirs, Stone built theirs in Richmond. We went forward, and I helped design it, and I was like, you know what, this doesn't feel right. I don't think we need it. And so it was a red flag for me. And it was definitely part of the reason why I decided that, this is the highest risk thing that this company has done. And I feel like it could be a possibility we don't survive this if we go forward with this $20 million project. And and there was some other red flags at the time that really kind of made me decide, okay, I better move on. And I guess it's time to go sort of chase that other dream of just doing my own little boutique brewery, which, it's kind of a weird thing after all these years to step back into a 10-barrel brew house and try to scratch out, a business.
Yeah.
It's tough.
So yeah, it is definitely tough, but it's also liberating in some ways, and has its own challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, let's talk about that. When did you decide that that's what you want to do? Were you still at Green Flash? Did you see the writing on the wall? I mean, it sounds like, probably there was an environment of like, I just thinking about a business cost cutting and maybe like trying to save here or there, and maybe because you were there part of the whole glory years of Green Flash, and the culture was changing. I mean, was that the reason in a lot of ways, or was it just it was time to go?
Yeah. Well, so the culture is changing at that point to some degree. And, um, so we started sort of chasing trends as opposed to being trendsetters that we had
Mhm.
been, pushing the envelope and stuff. Um, Instead of being, bold West Coast IPAs, Imperial IPAs, now it's session IPAs or
Mhm.
fruited version of IPA, which I thought was silly always and still. I think you can appreciate that moment. But it's funny, the pendulum swings. I've talked about other brewing companies, in earlier years, like Portland Brewing used to do a lot of fruited ales, and they were fun. But it's just a different direction. So, when we're starting to chase these trends and we forsake our flagship beer and do something like change the alcohol level to 8% from, a 7 or 7.5, 7.25% beer. I just, it's like, well, not only is that not the direction that the trend is going, it seemed like such a mistake when you just leave your flagship beer in its glory and just innovate and make something new. So I felt like the red flag there. And that was really the thing that I was forced to change that beer. And I was like, well, I knew if that moment ever came that I would be looking for the door. And that's actually what happened. So by 2014, so I had already, gone through that, I toughed it out for a year or two, and then I decided that I can't represent this beer the way I used to.
Mhm.
And it's just not fair for me to be out in public and talking up this 8% IPA that really was a lot, more interesting and when its original form. And so I kind of was disheartened by that change, and I decided it was time to go. And that was in 2014. Um, I just sort of had a moment like, okay, I don't have to stay here.
Yeah.
And even though we had such a great run, we had, I had anonymity, to create beers before we really had the strong run up. And, once the big dollars were moving in and production was, really hot and heavy with, the core brands, then, the innovation had to sort of shift and how that came around. But I just realized that at that moment, and I stuck around for a year after deciding that's not an easy thing to do, to decide that you want to move on from something that you've been, so instrumental in its success. Um, and I felt like I should get away from that risky venture, of building the Virginia brewery. And it turned out, to be the right thing to do, to leave.
Yeah.
And I didn't want my name on it anymore. And my name was, very much on our brand at Green Flash, putting me forward as the brewmaster. And, it was a huge sense of pride. And you see my Chuck Silva signature on the label.
That's right.
And,
I remember that.
so that was a fun thing. And so we got away from that, which was fine. And I just felt like it was time for me to go and just maybe
So when did that,
just
so
chase
you,
that dream, that romantic dream
well, yeah,
of,
I
of the
think we
small
all have
project.
it. Yeah, we all have it. We all kind of like, we work for somebody else and we think we can do it ourselves, and some of us are able to do it and some of us, are not. And there's like, those are both great paths. But so you're there for your last year at Green Flash. Are you already like looking at, spaces you want to go, you want to open a place, you're looking at cities, you're already,
Yeah.
are those wheels churning then? Is that what's going on?
Yeah. Well, yeah, in part. Part of it was like, okay, well, how do I undo where I'm, the situation I'm in? How do I resign from something that I'm so passionate about? Of course the passion's kind of fizzled a little bit, but um and I had a lot of things mapped out. I was actually in 2015, I was planning to get married, you know, after getting divorced earlier on. So I'm getting remarried. I've got travel planned, for representing Green Flash, and I have this whole England tour, and I'm going to, Copenhagen beer celebration. So I'm probably doing another trip in uh, Brew in Belgium, and just so many like really great things that are, what you dream of, as a
Mm-hmm.
home brewer, thinking, well, okay, well, if I can get in and have a career, how, spectacular would it be to,
Yeah.
have an opportunity to brew in Belgium, to brew in England, to, travel abroad and represent your brand, and sharing it on that scale is just, I think, exceeded everybody's expectations. So the run up was really amazing, and to create the beers that we did was also um, maybe even a little surprising at how bold and zesty the beer flavors were, and yet they were still really fun, enjoyable beers. But I think now it's like, okay, everybody likes something a little easier, but
Yeah. So
those
what,
beers
so what,
are still fun.
yeah. So when you left Green Flash, I mean, I think I remember you put out your own press release.
I did. And I wanted the story to not, I wanted it to come from me, because I felt like at that moment it was about me, still, be respectful, of course, of everything that Green Flash had done for me. And I did. And I, sent, this really heartfelt thank you to the Hinkleys and to Green Flash. And, but it kind of made it, uh,
More permanent.
yes, yeah.
You're definitely
But
cutting the cord right there.
yeah, in that moment, it wasn't just about leaving Green Flash. It was about
Yeah.
a new chapter. It's about Silva Brewing, and
Yeah.
so we decided to use my name, and so my wife and I, it was just the two of us that just started
Yeah.
that. So I'm like, all right, well, Silva Brewing. Some people are like, I think,
Well, it's
Mitch,
definitely a
Mitch
bold
went
move.
through his, yeah, Mitch went through his, woes of having to, come up with a name, and they finally launched New Realm. But, so we decided to go with the name, and hoping
Yeah.
that it would give us some instant street cred and help us get distribution deals, because I knew I would need some distribution, because we're going into a place where there's lower population, and our tasting room isn't going to be as busy as we would need it to be, like, say, if we're in San Diego or the Bay, where we have higher population density and good sales across the bar. So we just thought that using the Silva name would be a good
Well,
way
I
to
think
go.
it's brilliant. I mean, you kind of look back, even when you said earlier that your name was on every bottle of beer. People who knew who you were, people you were making these beers, you were winning awards. I mean, why wouldn't you cash in on that?
Right.
Use your name. People know you. You're your brand. I think that's a brilliant move.
Yeah. Yeah, and so we went with it.
Yeah.
But that was the first half of 2015, and then we finally got married, and we went on honeymoon, and I used my 10-year anniversary award that I got from the company to go visit Maui Brewing, which just happened to be Hawaii was where we honeymooned. And so that was just a nice way to coincide. But yeah, the award that Green Flash did create was at 10 years, you got a $5,000 award to go visit any brewery anywhere in the country that you wanted to go
Wow.
see. So what a treat that was.
Yeah.
And then, well, we're sitting in the cabana on the beach and we're thinking about the second half of the year. We're talking about, okay, now what? Now how do we make it all happen? And so I came up with some ideas, and I didn't want to leave. I wanted to leave and, the company in a good place. So I said, well, I'll do hop harvest and go do hop selection and make sure all the hop contracts are set, and I'll do one more GABF, and then I'll resign after that. And I did all that, and it was great. And in that time, we were starting to search for a home, um, and determining what region, what we were going to move to, et cetera. And it just so happened we won a gold medal with Lafrique on Saturday at GABF, and I resigned on Monday.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah.
That
So it
was
was a
like
nice.
that was your mic drop moment. Like,
Yes, exactly. That was fun.
Chuck Silva out.
I'm out, and I think it kind of shocked and surprised some people in the company, and so unfortunately, I think I could have done it in maybe a kinder way, perhaps, but I felt like it was just important to send out that release and say, hey, we're going to go do Silva Brewing now.
Yeah.
And
So Silva Brewing. So you're looking around, but you land in Paso, and you have
yeah,
roots in Paso. Was that the reason for moving it there?
yeah, in part. So my mom still lives in the county here, and we're looking at SLO County,
Mhm.
not necessarily Paso, but I mean there's different towns here, but Paso ended up being what my wife fell in love with, like the downtown area, and there's a couple hundred wineries here, but that was my goal. Is when we sat down to talk about regions, it was like, I want to be in wine country. I want to be a brewery in wine
Mhm.
country, and we can be a boutique brewery, and it just so happened that SLO just wasn't a great beer destination aside from Firestone Walker. And I
Mhm.
thought, you know what, there's an opportunity. I can come in and be an option and bring some really just delicious clean beers, and I can brew Kolsch and alt beer and pale and IPA, and just bring in some fresh beers, and then that worked, and we've had to roll with some changes. We had to make hazy because people are, well, are you guys going to make hazy IPA? It was never part of the
Yeah.
plan. So
Yeah.
we've gone through that, and I keep one on usually,
You
but
got to do it. It's like well, going back to Roger Davis at Faction, he will
oh yeah,
not
yeah.
brew a hazy. He will. I was like, dude, you got to play the hits sometimes. Just make one.
Yeah, we should get together, the three of us, and brew a hazy beer just
We
to
should at Roger's place,
at Roger's place.
and not tell him we're
Absolutely.
doing it until it's too late. Like he's like, what's all these oats and wheat doing here? What's going on?
Yeah, we'll just ship it there. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you've got your own place. So I mean, you're and there's a sense of liberation. I mean, of course, there's challenges of opening a place, and I'm sure you went through all that with construction, permitting, all those
Yeah.
things that happen. But
Yeah.
putting that all aside, and you just look at like what kind of beer program were you able to adopt that was that spoke to your creative itch that you weren't doing at Green Flash because of the constraints of production there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I did kind of, like I said, put that focus back into Kolsch and alt beer. I figured those would be introductions to beers for that speak to the inner Renaissance man in me, that I can sort
Mhm.
of revive some of those beer styles. And it went well enough, but it still ended up being that IPA wins the day.
Yeah.
And and Paso is a lot different than San Diego. There, you don't have the adventurous drinkers here that want to seek out, the latest Belgian creation or saison, or even historic Abbey style or Trappist style beers. That really doesn't. There isn't a strong presence here for that demand.
Mhm.
And so I did introduce some beers like that, and I did the Chuckamuck beer. So it's
Yeah.
my sort of new version of Lafrique up here, and I've done some saisons, and they're um, mildly successful, not largely successful. It's the IPA that's still and winning the day. And then when I released the cold IPA, the Laughing Pecker, named after our woodpeckers here in the oak trees in Paso Robles, because they laugh at us. We're walking by and they're laughing at us. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to name a beer after these woodpeckers. And so it sounds a little cheeky for some people have a hard
Yeah.
time saying the word pecker, but understandably for
Just
some
point to
people.
the trees.
Yeah, they're up there.
So you had to like adapt to the market, which is like, what any, business owner does. And so,
Yeah,
but
hazy
then
IPA,
hazy, yeah, yeah. But then
whatever.
you take on this new venture, a muck winery. Like
Yeah.
what's going on with that? I mean, how
Well,
did you, was that just because you were influenced by the region, or was it like something you'd always been interested in, or?
yeah. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to mention this because back in my homebrew days in Virginia, I was really interested in wine and I was kind of excited to learn how to make wine. Although it ended up being introduced to me how to make beer and then being easier access to the ingredients, etc. But I had a sort of a passion that I think I would have preferred to have entered winemaking before
Mhm.
and above beer making. But the beer ended up being, great. I love beer and I have, in my, my Navy days of travel, I've been able to try some different beers other than the Coors from the early teenage years. And, anyway, so the wine, access to the wine, Virginia wine, country was sort of growing. It was emerging
Mhm.
and some was good and some was marginal and so you kind of taste your way through it. There's wine festivals and I was having a really good time with that. So I actually have a passion for wine, and then when I would visit, I would come back to California, for instance, and just take my mom to Napa. I was like, all right,
Yeah.
let's go hang out in Napa, taste some wine. And so I really have a passion for good wine, and I wanted to have access to it in this period of my life and make some wine, whether it was just on the home level for myself, just find a place where I can ideally maybe have a little side project, right? So
Yeah.
and it works out. The laws change and now I can make wine in my brewing facility with the right license.
And by the way, you're in Paso Robles. I mean, there's no shortage of grapes around there. And also,
Yeah,
I guess folks to give you a helping hand and give you some, tips on and with either process or technology. So, I
yeah.
mean, that's got to be. I mean, you're like,
It's been great. Lots of
yeah,
friendly folks. Made some good winemaker friends and shared some beer and shared some wine and yeah, it's been really actually fun new venture for me to
mhm.
add winemaking to the mix and different, So I'm learning more. Steep learning
That's
curve.
awesome. I think that's a good place to stop. All right. Well, hey, Chuck, I want to thank you for being part of this Brewer to Brewer podcast. I love, talking to brewers about, could do this all day long, honestly. In fact, right now, I want to drive down to your place in Paso and have a beer with you and continue this conversation. But,
Sure.
and I'll definitely do that at some later
And we
date. But
didn't
right
even
now,
talk we didn't even talk about Japan.
no, we'll talk about that's part two, folks. Part two, the Silva Brewing 21st Amendment collaboration for Japan at the Brewers Cup in Yokohama next year. All right.
Awesome.
Uh, so thanks for listening, everybody. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media to support journalism in the beer space. Check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. I'm Shaun O'Sullivan of 21st Amendment. Thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast.
Cheers. Thanks, Shaun.
First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. First Tea has been working with brewers on a wide range of teas and botanicals in popular and successful beers. First Tea combines flexible order sizes with the experience you need to create innovative and successful craft beers. They get you the most direct to farm tea selection so that you are working with flavorful and consistent products. You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com or by emailing them at info@firsttea.com. That's FIRSDTEA.com.